The morning sun leaked through the cracks of the thin curtains, painting golden streaks across the worn-out walls of the small apartment. The kitchen smelled faintly of instant coffee and toast, but it was hardly enough to disguise the stale air of a place that had seen too many years without repair. Amara James, a 17-year-old high school senior, moved quietly through the kitchen as if every step needed to be measured. She was tall for her age, with braids tied back neatly, and eyes that always seemed to carry questions the world rarely wanted to answer. The bills on the table reminded her that today was just another ordinary day, ordinary struggles, ordinary hopes, ordinary disappointments. Her mother, exhausted from a night shift at the hospital, was asleep in the other room. Amara didn't wake her. She knew the weight her mother carried, the double shifts, the endless worry about keeping the electricity running, the quiet prayers that her daughter would live a life better than this. As Amara slipped on her backpack, she paused to look in the mirror. She practiced the smile she wore to school, the one that masked the tiredness beneath her eyes.
She was used to it by now.
People saw her as the quiet, smart one. Few noticed the weight she carried, or the fire inside her that longed for something greater. At school, the halls buzzed with chatter about prom, college applications, and weekend plans. Amara listened but didn't join in. Her focus was different: scholarships, part-time jobs, ways to help her mother. She longed for a future where choices weren't dictated by money, where she could breathe freely without worry. By the afternoon, she was working her shift at a downtown cafe. The place wasn't fancy. Wooden tables scratched by years of use, the smell of coffee beans in the air, the sound of jazz playing softly in the background, but it had its charm. For Amara, it was more than just a job. It was a place where she could watch people, learn their stories without asking questions, and dream of the world beyond her own. She moved quickly behind the counter, balancing orders, refilling cups, smiling politely at customers who rarely looked her in the eye. She was invisible here, but in a way, she liked it. Invisibility meant peace. But today, something felt different. A group of men in tailored suits entered, their presence shifting the atmosphere. Customers glanced up. Whispers followed them as they settled at a corner table. Among them was a man whose aura commanded attention, his suit immaculate, his watch gleaming, his posture straight and assured. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with sharp features and eyes that carried both weight and weariness. Amara didn't know his name yet. She only knew that he didn't belong here. A man like that belonged in skyscrapers, not in her cafe. She noted the way others reacted to him, with awe, curiosity, and caution. For Amara, it was just another order to take, another face to serve. She had no idea that in a few hours, this ordinary day would be anything but ordinary, that her life was about to shift in ways she could never have imagined. The cafe bustled with its usual morning energy. Conversations overlapped. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the clinking of cutlery added a rhythmic background hum. Amidst this routine, no one seemed to notice the tall man in the tailored charcoal suit sitting by the window. His presence carried quiet authority, the kind that drew subtle attention without needing to announce itself. He was the kind of man people assumed had everything together, calm, wealthy, powerful. Yet beneath his controlled exterior, something was unraveling. Ethan Ward, one of the country's most influential billionaires, had chosen this quiet cafe for its anonymity. Away from flashing cameras and corporate boardrooms, it was one of the few places where he could breathe without being reminded of the weight of his empire. But today, the very act of breathing betrayed him. At first, it was a faint tightness in his chest, the kind he had brushed off many times before. He tried to focus on the steaming cup of espresso in front of him, convincing himself it would pass. But within moments, the tightness grew sharper, turning into a suffocating pressure. His breaths came shallow, each inhale thinner than the last. His hand instinctively reached into his jacket pocket for his inhaler, but it wasn't there. Panic set in. Ethan's normally steady composure began to crack. He coughed, struggling to draw air, his body betraying him in front of strangers. Heads began to turn, whispers rippling through the cafe, as people noticed the billionaire gasping. Some recognized him, their curiosity outweighing their concern. Phones were raised, ready to capture the scene for headlines rather than offer help. But one pair of eyes didn't hesitate. Across the room, Amara, the young black waitress who had been moving swiftly between tables, froze when she saw him clutching his chest. The trays she carried clattered onto a nearby counter as she rushed toward him. Unlike the onlookers, she didn't care about his wealth, his name, or the attention his presence drew. She only saw a man on the edge of collapse. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, though his wheezing breaths answered for him. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His hand trembled against the table as if searching desperately for something that wasn't there. Amara's heart pounded, but her hands moved with steady precision. She knew the signs. Her younger brother had suffered from asthma for years. She dropped to his side, her voice firm but calm. "Stay with me. Slow breaths. Try to relax." Her gaze darted around the cafe. "Does anyone have an inhaler? Please," she shouted. A murmur spread, but no one responded. The crowd seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene. She turned back to him. Ethan's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. Time was slipping. Amara made a quick decision. She placed a steadying hand on his back, encouraging what little air he could manage. "Lean forward, like this. Don't fight it." Her voice, confident and sure, cut through his panic. Slowly, he followed her instructions, each breath still strained but slightly deeper than before. Finally, one of the baristas came rushing over with an emergency inhaler kept behind the counter. Amara grabbed it, pressed it into Ethan's hand, and helped guide it to his lips. A sharp hiss, a desperate inhale. Relief flooded through him. He coughed, then drew in a fuller breath, the tension in his shoulders loosening. For a moment, silence filled the cafe. Everyone watched as the billionaire slowly steadied himself, the storm inside his chest finally easing. His gaze lifted, locking onto the young woman kneeling at his side, her hand still on his arm for reassurance. Ethan Ward had been saved, not by wealth, not by power, but by the courage of a waitress who refused to stand by. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Ethan Ward sat slumped in his chair, still catching his breath. The tremors in his hands hadn't fully subsided, and a faint sheen of sweat clung to his forehead. Around him, the cafe had grown unusually quiet, the lively chatter replaced with awkward murmurs. Patrons exchanged glances, whispering about the billionaire who had nearly collapsed before their eyes. Some still had their phones raised, recording, eager to broadcast his moment of weakness to the world. But Amara didn't care about any of that. She remained beside him, crouched low, her hand steady on his arm. Her eyes weren't filled with curiosity or recognition of his fame. They were focused, grounded, human. "Are you okay now?" she asked softly, her tone carrying the kind of sincerity that disarmed even the most guarded hearts. Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her. For a man who lived in boardrooms filled with power brokers and million-dollar deals, vulnerability was foreign. Yet in this moment, staring into the eyes of a young woman in a cafe uniform, he realized he owed his very breath to her. I think so," he managed to rasp, still short of breath. Relief washed across Amara's face, and she finally allowed herself a small smile.
"Good.
Just take it slow. You'll be okay." The barista who had fetched the inhaler hovered nearby, wringing his hands nervously. "Do you want us to call an ambulance, sir?" he asked. Ethan shook his head faintly.
No. I'll be fine."
He trailed off, still overwhelmed, then turned his gaze back to Amara. "If it weren't for you." She cut him off gently, her voice firm but kind. "Don't thank me. Just take care of yourself. Asthma isn't something you can ignore." There was something about her tone that struck him. It wasn't deferential, not laced with awe or hesitation like so many others who spoke to him. She wasn't impressed by his suit, his presence, or the whispers of his name echoing through the cafe. She saw him as a man, not a billionaire. And that simple honesty felt more grounding than anything he'd experienced in years. For Amara, The adrenaline was only just beginning to fade. Her hands trembled slightly now, but she quickly wiped them on her apron and stood. She didn't want the spotlight. Saving him wasn't about recognition or reward. It was instinct, empathy, and memory of all the times she had rushed to her brother's side during an attack. But for Ethan, the moment lingered. Something inside him had shifted, like a crack opening in the carefully constructed walls around his life. He was used to control, to orchestrating outcomes, to never being at anyone's mercy. Yet here he was, alive, because a young waitress had refused to stand by. As the crowd began to return to their routines, Amara excused herself quietly and returned to work, refilling cups and wiping tables as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away. He followed her with his gaze, noting the determination in her steps, the quiet strength she carried. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt humbled. The billionaire, who thought he had everything, now realized how fragile life could be and how easily it could be saved by someone society often overlooked. That day in the cafe was more than a rescue. It was the beginning of a change Ethan couldn't yet name, a change that would ripple into both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The cafe settled back into its usual rhythm, but for Ethan Ward, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He sat there long after the tremors in his chest eased, his gaze following the young woman who had saved him. Amara moved briskly from table to table, carrying trays, refilling coffee, and greeting customers with quiet professionalism. She didn't look back at him once, as though the billionaire at the corner table was no different from the other patrons she served. Ethan wasn't used to being invisible. Wherever he went, people noticed him, whether for his wealth, his tailored suits, or the media stories that trailed behind him like shadows. Yet this woman, this barista, had looked past all of that and seen only the man gasping for air. He found himself rising to his feet, steadying himself with a breath, and walking toward the counter where she stood. The other staff glanced nervously at him, but Amara simply lifted her eyes and asked, "Do you need something else?" Her tone was even, polite, but not deferential. "Yes," Ethan replied, surprising even himself. "Your name?" Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't flinch. "Amara," she said. Then, with the same straightforwardness, "And you're Ethan Ward." There was no awe in her voice, no attempt to flatter or impress. She stated it as though she were naming the brand of coffee beans she used, just another fact of life. Ethan almost laughed, caught off guard by her disarming composure. "Amara," he repeated, letting the name settle. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," she said with a small shrug. "You just needed help and I helped. That's all." But it wasn't all, not to him. Ethan studied her closely, the sincerity in her eyes, the steadiness in her posture. She reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years: authenticity. People in his world wore masks of ambition, greed, or admiration. Amara wore none. A silence stretched between them before Amara broke it with a half-smile. "If you really want to thank me, try keeping your inhaler close. Makes it easier for everyone." Ethan chuckled, the sound rusty from the tension of earlier. "I'll keep that in mind." She turned to serve another customer, and though their conversation had lasted only moments, Ethan knew something had shifted. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a spark of curiosity, a sense that their paths weren't meant to cross only once. As he left the cafe, Ethan glanced back through the window. Amara was laughing softly with an elderly customer, her face lit with warmth. That image etched itself into his mind, sharper than any deal he had closed, any photograph he had posed for. For Amara, the billionaire's attention meant little. She had lived long enough to know that encounters with powerful people rarely changed lives like hers. Still, there was a strange weight in her chest, as though the moment mattered more than she wanted to admit. Neither of them knew it yet, but this chance meeting wasn't fleeting. It was the beginning of something neither status nor circumstance could erase, a lasting impression that would follow them into the days ahead. The days after the cafe incident unfolded like two parallel stories, each character living in vastly different worlds that seemed impossible to bridge. For Ethan Ward, life resumed in the gleaming towers of his corporate empire. Boardrooms, flashing cameras, and meticulously scheduled meetings defined his existence. His face appeared in business journals and financial broadcasts, where he was praised as a visionary tycoon, a man whose wealth and influence could shift markets. Yet, behind the polished exterior, Ethan found himself distracted. He replayed the cafe encounter in quiet moments, Amara's steady gaze, her lack of pretense, her refusal to treat him as anything other than a man in need. It was unsettling. Everyone around him wanted something from him: partnerships, favors, wealth. But Amara wanted nothing. That made her unforgettable. Meanwhile, Amara's life carried on in the modest neighborhood she called home. She rose before dawn, her alarm clock buzzing in the small apartment she shared with her younger brother, Malik. She brewed coffee in a chipped pot, packed his school lunch, and hurried to catch the early bus to the cafe. Her life was a rhythm of responsibility, each day marked by the urgency of survival. Unlike Ethan, her world held no luxuries. The bills stacked on the counter, and she juggled shifts to keep the electricity on. Yet, despite the hardships, there was pride in how she endured. She didn't allow herself to complain, because Malik looked up to her with wide, hopeful eyes. To him, she wasn't just his sister, she was his hero. In these two different universes, Ethan and Amara thought of each other more often than they admitted. Ethan admired her independence, though he barely knew her. Amara remembered the gratitude in his voice, though she told herself it meant nothing. The contrast between their lives couldn't have been sharper. Ethan dined in private clubs and traveled in sleek cars that waited at curbsides. Amara rushed between shifts, often skipping meals to stretch her paycheck a little further. He was cushioned by luxury, she was hardened by necessity. And yet, they shared a curious commonality: loneliness. For Ethan, it was the isolation of wealth, of people who saw his fortune but not his humanity. For Amara, it was the burden of responsibility, carrying more than her years should demand, with no one to lean on. One evening, as Ethan reviewed documents in his penthouse overlooking the city, he paused at the window. The skyline glittered, cold and breathtaking, but all he could picture was the warmth in Amara's smile as she spoke to that elderly customer. He realized he hadn't seen genuine joy in years. At the same time, Amara sat on her small balcony, the hum of the city filling the silence. Malik was asleep, and she finally let her shoulders slump, the exhaustion pressing down. In the quiet, she thought of the stranger she had saved, the billionaire everyone admired but who, in that moment, had simply been a man fighting for breath. Their worlds were apart, but fate had already begun stitching invisible threads between them. Neither knew how tightly those threads would pull, nor how drastically their lives were about to intertwine. Ethan Ward wasn't a man who let debts linger. In business, gratitude was often transactional, favors repaid with interest, alliances sealed with carefully calculated gifts. But this was different. What Amara had given him wasn't something money could buy, it was his life, wrestled back from the grip of an asthma attack. For days, he mulled over how to thank her. Sending money felt insulting. He knew enough about her pride to understand she would never accept it. A grand gesture, however, might communicate his sincerity. Something that showed he valued her, not as a savior in a desperate moment, but as a person who mattered. So one evening after work, Ethan called his assistant, Daniel. "Find her," he said simply. Daniel blinked. "Her, sir?" "The girl from the cafe." Ethan's tone left no room for doubt. "I owe her more than words." It wasn't easy. Amara lived in a quiet neighborhood that rarely brushed against the orbit of billionaires. But within a week, Ethan's sleek car pulled up outside the cafe where she worked. Heads turned the moment he stepped through the door. He was out of place, an Armani suit in a room full of worn aprons and steaming mugs. Amara froze behind the counter when she saw him. Her first thought was that he must have lost something, or worse, that he was here to complain. But the small smile on his face disarmed her. "Can we talk?" he asked gently. She hesitated, glancing at her manager, who was too stunned to say no. Minutes later, They sat at a corner table. Ethan placed a small velvet box on the table between them. "I didn't come here to overwhelm you," he began, noticing her wary expression. "But you saved my life. I needed you to know that I don't take that lightly." Amara crossed her arms.
You don't owe me anything.
"Anyone would have helped." "Not anyone," Ethan countered. "Most people would have frozen or panicked. You acted. That means something." She sighed, unsure how to respond. Curiosity eventually got the better of her, and she opened the velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, simple yet elegant, with a charm shaped like a heart. Not ostentatious, not dripping in diamonds, just thoughtful. Amara's lips parted slightly in surprise. "It's beautiful." "It's not about the price," Ethan said quickly, sensing her hesitation. "It's a reminder. That one moment of courage can change everything. You reminded me of that." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Amara looked down at the bracelet, conflicted. She wanted to refuse. It felt too much, but something in his eyes told her this wasn't just a gift. It was a bridge. Finally, she slipped it onto her wrist. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan's smile softened, the kind that melted his usual steel demeanor.
No.
"Thank you." As he left the cafe, head still turning, Amara looked down at the bracelet, her heart unexpectedly light. She didn't realize it yet, but this small gesture of gratitude was only the beginning of a connection that would change both of their lives forever. Amara hadn't expected to see Ethan Ward again after the day he brought her the bracelet. She wore it often, though, tucked beneath her sleeve while she worked, its delicate weight reminding her of the strange intersection of their worlds. To her, it was a closed chapter. A billionaire had thanked her, and life had gone back to normal. Or so she thought. One Saturday morning, as she cleared tables at the cafe, a familiar black car pulled up outside. Her co-workers gasped, whispering when Ethan stepped out, impeccably dressed yet carrying an ease in his posture that made the room still. Amara's heart skipped. What could he possibly want now? "Amara," he greeted warmly, his voice carrying just enough authority to hush the chatter around them. "I hope I'm not intruding." She blinked, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "You again?" His smile widened. "Again. But this time, I have a request." Her brows furrowed. "A request?"
Yes. Dinner.
"With me." The cafe erupted into murmurs, and Amara nearly dropped the tray in her hands. "Dinner? With him? A billionaire?" She almost laughed at the absurdity, but Ethan's eyes were steady, sincere, and not at all playful. "Why?" she blurted out, more defensive than she intended. Ethan leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. "Because you intrigue me. Most people I meet, they want something from me. Power, money, connections. You wanted nothing. You gave and then walked away. That's rare. And I'd like to know more about the person who saved my life." Her instinct told her to refuse. This was dangerous territory, too much exposure, too much attention. She didn't belong in his world. Yet another part of her, quieter but persistent, whispered, "What harm could one dinner do?" "I don't think I'd fit into your world," she said carefully. "Then let's meet somewhere that feels like yours," Ethan replied smoothly. "No suits, no reservations, no paparazzi. Just two people sharing a meal." Amara stared at him, caught off guard. He wasn't pressuring, just inviting, like someone extending a hand across an invisible divide. Slowly, she nodded. "One dinner. That's it." The following evening, they met at a small, family-owned diner near her neighborhood. Ethan arrived without his usual entourage, dressed simply in a button-down and jeans. Amara was startled by how much younger, almost human, he looked outside the armor of wealth. Over burgers and fries they talked. Not about business empires or billion-dollar deals, but about childhood memories, favorite foods, books they'd read. Amara found herself laughing more than she expected, her guard slowly lowering as Ethan revealed a side of himself few ever saw, a man who craved simplicity, who carried loneliness behind his polished smile. By the time the meal ended, Amara realized something unsettling. She no longer saw Ethan Ward, the untouchable billionaire.
She saw Ethan, the man.
And that realization terrified her more than anything else. The dinner had been simple, ordinary by any standard, but for Ethan and Amara, it marked the beginning of something neither expected. Ethan found himself replaying their conversations in his head long after he returned home. Her laughter, genuine and unforced, stayed with him in a way that the most extravagant events never did. For Amara, the evening was equally unsettling. She tried to convince herself it was just a meal, a thank you gesture stretched too far. But every time she remembered the way Ethan listened, really listened, to her words, it stirred something she hadn't felt in years. Someone had seen her not as the girl from the cafe, but as a person with thoughts and dreams worth hearing. Days turned into weeks, and their paths crossed more often. Sometimes, Ethan appeared at the cafe, ordering coffee just to sit quietly and watch her work. Other times, he sent her a message, asking if she'd like to meet for a walk or lunch. Each time, Amara hesitated, torn between caution and curiosity, but eventually found herself saying yes. With every encounter, their worlds collided a little more. One evening, Ethan invited her to a charity gala, an event he claimed would be low-key. Amara nearly refused, imagining the stares, the whispers, the cruel judgment of high society. But something in Ethan's hopeful expression weakened her resistance. Reluctantly, she agreed. When she arrived, nerves knotted in her stomach. Dressed in a simple yet elegant gown borrowed from her cousin, she felt every pair of eyes follow her as she entered. The room shimmered with chandeliers and jewels, the air thick with perfume and wealth. She had never felt so out of place. Whispers spread quickly. Who is she? Why is she with him? But Ethan never left her side. He introduced her proudly, ignoring the raised brows and tight smiles. This is Amara, he said, his voice carrying a quiet defiance. To him, she wasn't a novelty or a spectacle. She was his guest, his equal for the night. Amara noticed how people's tones shifted around her. Some masked their discomfort with polite smiles, while others couldn't hide their disdain. She kept her head high, refusing to shrink, even as doubt gnawed at her. Later that night, after the gala, Ethan drove her home. Silence lingered until Amara finally spoke. You don't care what they think, do you? He glanced at her, his jaw set. I've lived too long letting others dictate my life. For once, I want to choose what matters to me. And right now, that's you. Her breath caught at the intensity in his words. She wanted to argue, to remind him that she wasn't from his world, that their lives weren't meant to intertwine. But as the city lights blurred past the window, all she could think was how different, how alive, she felt with him. Two worlds were crossing, and neither could pretend it didn't matter anymore. Amara's life had always been defined by limitations. The invisible chains of expectation, poverty, and judgment wrapped around her from childhood. She had learned early on not to dream too boldly, because the world was quick to remind her of where she belonged. But after meeting Ethan, those chains felt weaker, like they could finally be broken. Still, the closer she got to him, the heavier those chains seemed to grow. At the cafe, her co-workers whispered, some in envy, others in disbelief. Customers stared, some curious, others cruel. A girl like you doesn't belong in his world, one customer muttered under their breath, words that burned long after Amara pretended not to hear. At home, things weren't much easier. Her mother, exhausted from years of working 2 jobs, warned her not to get carried away. Men like him, they don't stay. Don't let him be another disappointment, Amara. The warning came from love, but it still stung. For Ethan, the chains were different, but chains nonetheless. His family, powerful and wealthy, had spent generations preserving their reputation. His father, a stern businessman, reminded him constantly of his duty, the family name, the company, the legacy. And now this girl, this cafe worker, was threatening the perfect image they had worked so hard to maintain. One evening, the confrontation came. Ethan's father summoned him to the family estate, his tone clipped and formal. The meeting felt less like a conversation and more like a trial. You're jeopardizing everything, his father said coldly. This fascination with her, it's reckless. Do you know what people are saying? Ethan clenched his fists. I don't care what people say. She's kind, intelligent, strong. She matters to me. His father's glare was sharp enough to cut through steel. You are Sullivan. That name means something. You will not throw it away for a distraction. The word rang in Ethan's ears. Distraction. That's how his father saw Amara. But to him, she was anything but. Meanwhile, Amara struggled with her own doubts. Was she dragging Ethan down? Was she worth the storm he was facing? She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the voice inside her that whispered she wasn't enough. Yet another voice, quieter but stronger, told her that maybe this was her chance to rise, to finally break free from the chains that had bound her for so long. The breaking point came days later, when Ethan showed up at the cafe, his expression fierce. He didn't care about the whispers, the stares, the threats from his family. I'm done living by their rules, he told her. I want my life to be mine, and I want you in it. Amara's breath caught. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that he meant it. For the first time, someone was willing to fight for her. And in that moment, the chains that had bound them both, hers of doubt and his of duty, began to shatter. The night after Ethan's declaration, Amara couldn't sleep. His words echoed in her mind, heavy with promise. I want my life to be mine, and I want you in it. No one had ever said something so fiercely, so openly, for her. But she knew it wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was a choice that could upend both of their worlds. The following day, Ethan made his stand. He arranged a meeting with the Sullivan board, where his father and closest advisors gathered. It was supposed to be about quarterly reports, but Ethan turned the room into a battlefield. I'm stepping back, he announced, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of rebellion. Gasps rippled across the polished mahogany table. His father's face turned a dangerous shade of red. You're what? His father spat. I'm stepping back. I'll continue to invest, but I won't be bound by this, by all of this. Ethan's hand gestured at the gilded walls, the suffocating expectations, the empire built on appearances. I've spent years living for everyone else's version of me. That ends now. His words left the room in stunned silence. For the first time in his life, Ethan wasn't just the heir. He was a man carving his own path. Meanwhile, Amara made her own decision. The fear of judgment had weighed on her for too long, but she realized that hiding would only keep her in the same cycle. So she enrolled in a night course in communications, determined to build her skills and her confidence. She refused to let the world reduce her to a girl from a cafe who got lucky. She wanted to prove, to herself and to the world, that she had a future worth fighting for. There are two choices, Ethan stepping away from power and Amara stepping into her own, were the turning point. But change rarely comes without resistance. Whispers intensified in the city's social circles. Tabloids printed pictures of Ethan and Amara, framing her as a nobody and questioning his sanity. Ethan's father publicly criticized his son's reckless behavior, further fueling the fire. Amara faced her own battles at the cafe. Some customers treated her like a celebrity, others like a scandal. A co-worker sneered one day, "Don't forget where you came from. People like him don't marry girls like you." Instead of shrinking, Amara straightened her back. "People like me are worth just as much as anyone else," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. It was the first time she had openly defended herself, and it felt like breaking yet another chain. Together, Ethan and Amara leaned on each other through the storm. They weren't naive, love alone wouldn't erase their struggles. But they had reached the point of no return. They had chosen each other, and that choice, bold and terrifying as it was, set everything into motion. The turning point wasn't just about falling in love. It was about rewriting the rules of their lives. From this moment on, they weren't bound by the past. They were building a future, brick by brick, side by side. The storm had passed, but the air still carried a heaviness. Ethan and Amara stepped into a world forever changed by their decisions. For Ethan, It was the first time he woke without the weight of the family empire pressing on his chest. For Amara, it was the first time she looked into the mirror and saw not just a survivor, but a young woman with purpose. Their new world was not gilded with luxury nor free of challenges. It was a blend of chaos and clarity. Ethan, once chauffeured everywhere, now drove himself in a modest black sedan. He insisted on it. "If I can't even drive myself, how can I claim to live for myself?" he said with a wry grin. Amara, amused but supportive, sat beside him, noticing how much lighter he seemed when stripped of titles. Amara, on the other hand, began her evening classes at the local community college. Balancing shifts at the cafe with late-night coursework wasn't easy, but every page of notes, every assignment turned in, gave her a sense of pride she had never known. Ethan sometimes stayed up with her, reviewing business terms or simply brewing her coffee while she worked. It was their quiet way of building together. Yet, not everyone welcomed this new chapter. Ethan's father unleashed his fury, cutting off certain privileges and financial ties. "You're embarrassing us," he declared during one terse phone call. Ethan's response was calm but final. "If your pride matters more than my happiness, then maybe embarrassment is what we need." The tabloids continued their circus, publishing speculative headlines. Billionaires fall from grace. Mystery girl at the heart of the Sullivan scandal. Amara found herself at the center of attention she never asked for. Strangers whispered when she walked into stores, and some online voices mocked her background. But with Ethan at her side, she refused to let it define her. Despite the backlash, there were small victories that made their new life worth it. Amara's younger brother, Jamal, looked at her differently now, no longer with the quiet pity of someone watching a sister carry too much, but with admiration. "You're really doing it, huh?" he said one evening, pride gleaming in his eyes. That simple acknowledgement was worth more than any headline. For Ethan, the joy came from freedom. He began exploring projects outside his father's shadow, small investments in community businesses. He partnered with Amara's cafe manager to expand the shop into a chain, not because of profit, but because he believed in it. "This is the kind of empire I want to build, something real, something human," he told her. Their world was new, not perfect. There were days when doubt crept in, when the gossip felt too loud or the responsibilities too heavy. But each night, when Amara closed her books and Ethan shut his laptop, they found comfort in knowing they had chosen this path together. It was not the world they were born into, it was the world they were creating. And in that creation, they found the truest form of freedom. The calm of their new world was short-lived. Life had a way of testing the very foundations of what Ethan and Amara had built, and soon they would discover whether their bond was strong enough to withstand the storm. It began quietly with whispers. A journalist approached Amara outside her college, offering her a chance to tell her side of the story. "You could be paid handsomely," the woman said, her pen poised, eyes hungry. Amara shook her head and walked away, but the temptation lingered. Money had always been scarce, and now with her brother's tuition looming, the thought clawed at her. She didn't tell Ethan, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she feared how much weight he already carried. At the same time, Ethan was being cornered. His father had sent lawyers, dangling one final offer. "Cut ties with the girl, and your place in the company will be restored. Refuse, and you'll be erased completely." Ethan knew what was at stake: the Sullivan empire, the wealth, the legacy. It wasn't just a fortune, it was the name his family had built for generations. Turning it down meant a kind of exile. When Ethan shared the ultimatum with Amara, she froze. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. Her voice carried both fear and hope. Ethan looked at her for a long time, torn between bloodline and love, between duty and freedom. "I don't know yet," he admitted, and the honesty cut deeper than any false assurance could have. The tension between them grew. Amara noticed Ethan working later, meeting with lawyers, his phone buzzing with calls from investors. She worried that the life he was leaving behind was pulling him back. Ethan, meanwhile, felt Amara's distance. Her silence about the journalist weighed on her, and he could feel her holding something back. Their unspoken fears finally clashed one evening. "You're slipping away," Amara accused, her eyes burning. "And you're hiding something," Ethan shot back. The words fell like daggers between them. At that moment, their loyalty was on trial. Not to the world, not to their families, but to each other. After the storm of accusations, silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Amara broke it. She confessed about the journalist, about the money, about the temptation she had resisted but hadn't been able to shake off. Ethan listened, his face unreadable. Finally, he sighed. "You should have told me. I'd rather struggle with you than win without you." Amara's eyes softened, tears breaking through. And then Ethan revealed his own decision. "I walked away. From the company, the legacy, all of it. They can take my name, but they can't take us." It was in that raw, vulnerable moment that their loyalty was sealed, not because they were perfect, but because they chose each other, flaws and fears included. The test had not broken them. It had made them unshakable. The night was quiet, but Layla's heart thundered as though the world itself waited for her decision. The whirlwind of events, the rescue, the invitations, the betrayals, and the moments of doubt had led her here. Standing on the terrace of Alexander Grant's estate, she looked at the billionaire whose life she had once saved and realized he had changed hers in ways she never imagined. Alexander spoke softly, his voice stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. "You didn't just save my life that day, Layla. You gave me something money could never buy, a reason to change, a reason to see people, not power." His words struck deep. For Layla, a girl who had grown up believing her voice was too small for the world to hear, it felt surreal. She had once been invisible, moving through life with the weight of society's indifference pressing her down. Now, standing here, she was not only seen but valued. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said gently, her eyes steady on his. "I just couldn't watch someone suffer. It's who I am." Alexander gave a small smile, the kind of smile that carried humility rather than pride. "And that's why you've changed me. Because you did what no one else would without expecting anything in return." They stood in silence for a moment, the cool night air carrying with it a sense of closure. Behind them, the grand house, once a symbol of wealth and distance, now felt less like a fortress and more like a bridge between two worlds. Layla thought of her past, the struggles, the whispered doubts, the way society had tried to chain her to invisibility. Saving Alexander had opened doors, yes, but more than that, it had awakened her own strength. She was no longer the girl who blended into shadows. She was a woman who had learned that courage, even in small acts, could alter the course of a life. "Where will you go from here?" Alexander asked, his tone not commanding but curious. Layla looked out at the city lights twinkling below, each one a reminder of countless stories, countless lives waiting to be touched. "Forward," she said firmly. "There's so much to do. So many people who feel unseen, unheard. Maybe my story can change something for them, too." For the first time, she saw admiration in Alexander's eyes, not for her bravery in saving him but for the strength she carried within herself. It was no longer about billionaire and savior, but about two people whose lives had intersected in an unexpected, life-altering way. As Layla walked away from the terrace, she felt lighter. The past no longer chained her. The future no longer frightened her. She had found her voice in the most unlikely of places, through an act of compassion that echoed far beyond the moment. And as the night closed in, Layla understood the truth. Saving a life had given her one of her own.